everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Francois Bernier. He was French by birth and doctor by profession and was a political philosopher and historian. He came to the Mughal Empire in search of opportunities. He lived in India for 12 years from 1656 to 1668. He was a physician to Prince Dara Shikoh, the eldest son of Emperor Shah Jahan. Bernier traveled to different parts of the country and wrote accounts based on his own observations and compared the social conditions in India with the situation in Europe. He dedicated his works to Louis XIV, the King of France. His works were published in France in 1670 to 71 and translated into English, Dutch, German, and Italian. He has compared east to the west, and his travels in Mughal Empire provided a detailed observation and critical insight. He constantly compared Mughal India with the contemporary Europe. He emphasized the superiority of the European society. Bernier's description on the social condition of India. He described Indian society as consisting of the undifferentiated masses of very rich and powerful ruling class. There was a wide gap between the poorest of poor and the richest of the rich. He say there is no middle state in India. That means there is no middle class in India. Indian society, according to Francois Bernier, there was a rich ruling class, there was no middle class, and poor people were there. In fact, he was not having very good impression about India. He has written a lot about the question of land ownership. He says it had ruined the agriculture and oppressed the peasants, and the living standards of the sections of society declined except the ruling aristocracy. According to him, one of the fundamental difference between Mughal India and the Europe was the lack of private property in the Indian society. He had a firm belief in the virtue of private property. Crown ownership of the land was harmful for both state and its people. He thought that Mughal emperor owned all the land and distributed it among the nobles. He argued that lands were the crown ownership could not be passed on to their children. So, they were adverse to any long-term investment in the sustenance and expansion of production. The absence of private property prevented the emergence of the class of improving landlords as it was in Western Europe to maintain and improve the land. Bernier's description of the Mughal emperor and his subjects, he has written that Mughal emperor was the king of beggars and the barbarians. Its cities and towns were ruined and contaminated with the ill air, and its fields overspread with bushes and full of pestilential marshes. He attributed all these problems to the crown ownership of land. Bernier says that there was the practice of crown ownership of land and no private ownership of land or private property, but none of the Mughal officials documents show that the state was sole owner of the land. According to the official chronicler of the Akbar's reign, Abul Fazl, the Mughal emperor collected only the remunerations from the people for the protection given by the state, and no rent was collected. Bernier regarded the remuneration as land revenue since it was very high sometimes. Bernier's description on land ownership in Mughal India, he writes, none of the Mughal officials documented state that the king was the sole owner of the land. Abul Fazl has stated that land revenue demanded was imposed not as rent but as payment for the protection. The king provided his subjects. The evil effects of the crown ownership of land he has described. Number one, absence of ownership of land. Landholders could not pass on their land to their children. Thus, they did not take any interest in increasing production. It prevented the emergence of improving landlords. It led to the ruination of the agriculture. It brought a continuous decline in the living standard of all sections of society. It led to the excessive oppression of the peasantry. Bernier's description of land ownership influenced Western theorists from 18th century onwards. For instance, French philosopher Montesquieu used Bernier's accounts and developed the idea of Oriental despotism. According to the idea in Asia, the kings enjoyed absolute authority over his subjects and owned all the lands. There was no private property. All people except king and nobles struggled for survival. The ideal of Oriental despotism, or you can say tyranny. Asiatic mode of production. Karl Marx further developed the idea of Oriental despotism as Asiatic mode of production. Before colonialism, surplus production was appropriated by the state. This led to the emergence of a society that was composed of a large number of autonomous and egalitarian village communities. The imperial court respected these villages as long as the flow of the surplus was continued. Marx regarded this as a stagnant system. What was the more complex social reality which Bernier noticed in the Mughal Empire? He again writes that artisans had no incentive to improve the quality of their manufacturers. Profits were appropriated by the state. Production was on the verge of decline. Vast quantities of the world's precious metal, gold and silver flowed into India in exporting manufacturers. He has described the Mughal cities and said that the 15% of the population lived in the towns. Bernier described Mughal cities as camp towns. All kinds of towns, manufacturing towns, trading towns, port towns, sacred centers, pilgrimage, etc. Their existence indicates the prosperity of the merchant communities. Merchants, a strong community, organized into caste cum occupational groups. Bernier was very much moved with the practice of sati. He has provided a detailed description of sati. In his account, he mentioned that while some women seemed to embrace death cheerfully, others were forced to take the death. Women labor was crucial in both agricultural and non-agricultural production. Bernier has written very widely, extensively about the women labor. Therefore, it seems unlikely the women were confined to the private spaces of their homes. Women from merchant families participated in the commercial activities too. So this is the way how Bernier was not having very a good impression about the Indian system, and he describes that Indian system was not so good, and ultimately he described the Indian ruler as the ruler or the king of beggars and barbarians. So in fact, he had this kind of idea, he had this kind of impression